This is BBC News. I'm Rita Chakrabarti. The headlines at 2. An extra £3.5 billion to help pay for the removal of flammable cladding from buildings in England. Critics say it's come too late, but ministers call it a major investment in building safety.
I'm announcing an unprecedented intervention. A clear plan to remove unsafe cladding, to provide certainty to leaseholders, to make the industry pay for its faults of the past.
The Prime Minister defends the fines and possible prison terms for those who lie about travelling from COVID hotspots. The second impeachment trial of Donald Trump will resume after senators agree the process is constitutional. Get your COVID jab, so says England's Deputy Chief Medical Officer to people from ethnic minorities amid concern about a lower take-up.
The big message I have for everyone listening is that, look, this virus just doesn't care what ethnic background you're from. It just doesn't care about the colour of your skin or where you live in the world or any of these things. It just cares that you're a human being.
I believe you have a filter turned on in the video settings.
And coming up this hour, the perils of the Zoom call. A forlorn Texas lawyer tells the judge, "I am not a cat," as he's defeated by a kitten filter. Good afternoon and welcome to BBC News. The Housing Secretary, Robert Jenrick, has announced an extra £3.5 billion for the removal of flammable cladding from buildings in England. It'll apply to properties over 18 metres. A levy will be imposed on builders developing certain new high-rise blocks. The government set up a £1.6 billion fund last year in response to the Grenfell Tower fire in 2017, but it's been under pressure to increase that amount. Thousands of flat owners are facing huge bills for safety improvements, and in many cases, people are unable to sell their homes. Mr. Jenrick has been speaking in the Commons.
We will make further funding available to pay for the removal and replacement of unsafe cladding for all leaseholders in high-rise residential buildings of 18 metres and above, or above 6 stories in England. We continue to take a safety-led approach, and this funding will focus on the higher-rise buildings where the independent expert advisory panel tells us, time and again, the overwhelming majority of the safety risk lies, in line with the existing Building Safety Fund and the anticipated scope of the new Building Safety Regulator that we're establishing and will shortly be legislating for. This will ensure that we end the cladding scandal in a way that is fair and generous to leaseholders. Secondly, for lower and medium-rise blocks of flats, the risks are significantly lower, and the remediation of cladding is less likely to be needed. In many cases, it will not be needed at all. But where it is, costs can still be significant for leaseholders, which is why I'm announcing today that the government will develop a long-term scheme to protect leaseholders in this situation with financial support for cladding remediation on buildings between 4 and 6 stories. Under a long-term low-interest scheme, no leaseholder will ever pay more than £50 a month towards the removal of unsafe cladding, many far less.
We can speak now to our political correspondent, Damien Grammaticus, who's at Westminster for us. Damien, the government had been under a lot of pressure to act further on this. What sort of reaction has there been?
Well, a sort of mixed reaction and quite a critical reaction from the opposition, but also from a few Conservatives too. I mean, the government, yes, under pressure because we're now, more than 3 years since the Grenfell Tower tragedy. There are many, many buildings that have not, where the issue has not been addressed. Hundreds thousands of people affected by this, their lives deeply affected. And what Labour has been saying, Labour's deputy leader, Angela Rayner, has been tweeting saying that this is not a solution that addresses some of the issues, because she says that leaseholders should not and must not pay for the cladding crisis that was caused by dodgy developers, cowboy builders and manufacturers of flammable cladding. That's one of the issues, is that this question that it will be these taller buildings, high-rise buildings, where the costs are covered, but not those sort of 4 to 6 stories high. And that's why the Labour Shadow Housing Secretary Tanguy Debonnaire said in the Commons in response to that statement that this was piling financial misery on some owners and was an injustice.
Buying your first home should be a dream come true. But for many, it's now been a nightmare for years. As a result of government choices, 3.5 years on from the Grenfell tragedy in which 72 people lost their lives, hundreds of thousands of people are still trapped in unsafe homes, many more unable to move. And today's announcement is too late for too many. It's a repeat of undelivered promises and backtracks on the key one that leaseholders should have no costs to pay. The Chancellor said last March, all unsafe combustible cladding will be removed from every private and social residential building above 18 metres high, but that has not happened. Buildings haven't been able to access the fund, and £9 out of 10 is still sitting where it was. At every stage, the government underestimated the problem and delays caused it to grow. They still don't know how many buildings are unsafe, where they are, or what danger they pose. And until we have answers to those basic questions, government will continue to make mistakes.
So what the Labour Party wants is an independent body to prioritise, to look at this and prioritise which are the most at-risk buildings, which should be done first. It doesn't want those who who have the lower-rise buildings to have to pay costs that could be £50 a month into the future. A couple of the other issues here that have been raised in reaction to this is that, whether the government should be pursuing those responsible for the cladding in the first place and the buildings in the first place. They have said they're bringing in a tax on developers, which should bring in about £2 billion to help pay for this. But some Conservative MPs not happy. We've had Stephen McPartland, who tweeted that he listened to this announcement, he said, with his head in his hands, wondering how the government could have got this so wrong. It's a betrayal of millions of leaseholders, he said. And what he pointed to was a couple of issues. One issue with ongoing insurance costs for those living in these buildings, which are high and unaffordable for many. Also, how people are dealing with the current fire safety defects, things like having to pay for waking watchers, for people to patrol the buildings 24 hours a day to ensure that there are no fires, and that those are ongoing costs that people are bearing.
OK, Damien, many thanks. Our correspondent Damien Grammaticus there. Well, today's announcement won't affect people living in low-rise properties, like our next guest, Paul Afshar. He's part of the Homeowners of L&Q campaign group, and that's made up of leaseholders and shared owners affected by properties with unsafe cladding. Good afternoon to you, Paul. Tell us a little bit more about the building that you're in, where you have your flat, and the sort of costs that you're now having to bear.
Well, the building that I'm in is one of those buildings that won't, unfortunately, be affected by today's announcement, in the sense that it's 4 stories high. It doesn't meet the government's criteria, the seemingly arbitrary criteria of 18 metres. And it's one where, for me, I'm now going to be forced to take out a loan, as your political correspondent said, a loan for much longer than my mortgage term, in order to pay for cladding, dangerous cladding that I didn't ask for, and certainly shouldn't have to pay for to remove. The challenge is that the Prime Minister last week stood up at the dispatch box and promised us that leaseholders would not have to and should not have to pay for the cost of removing dangerous cladding. And today's announcement feels like a betrayal for hundreds of thousands and millions of homeowners like myself up and down the country.
There is a separate scheme, I think, being proposed for people in smaller buildings like yourself?
It's a long-term loan mechanism that's being proposed. The challenge with that is twofold. One, I don't know how long I'm going to have to pay off this loan for. It could be longer than 30 years, which, as I said, is longer than my mortgage. The second is I don't know whether that loan is going to saddle me for the rest of my life until I pay it off, whether it follows me into different properties or whether it stays to the property. Today's announcement has done absolutely nothing to help out homeowners like myself who are having sleepless nights worrying about the state of the cladding on our building, and of course worrying about paying for its removal when we didn't cause it in the first place.
If you were able to, would you like to sell the property and move?
I have actually tried to sell the property twice in the last 12 months and move. Mortgage lenders, in fact, most mortgage lenders in the UK will not lend on a property like mine or lend to someone who is looking to buy it. So I'm stuck for the time being in this flat, unable to sell it, with an asset worth potentially nothing, and certainly not helped by today's government announcement. We had such high hopes from Robert Jenrick, the Housing Minister, today, and I have to say the nightmare continues for many of us.
And the costs that you're going to have to bear, are they uniquely for removing the cladding, or are there other costs as well? Because we heard from our correspondent, insurance costs have gone up, there are fire safety defects that people are looking at. I don't know if you have waking watchers in your building, perhaps not because it's a low rise, but tell me.
The costs are actually astronomical, and as you say, Rita, it's not just the cost of removing the cladding, which of course is a huge cost in and of itself, sometimes 30, 40, 50,000 pounds per flat. The costs are also around waking watch fire patrols. These costs are crippling. You have one of our members, Hayley Tillotson in Leeds, who had to declare bankruptcy because of the crippling costs of hundreds of pounds a month on top of her mortgage to pay for a man to walk around her building to tell her that it wasn't on fire, in addition to the astronomical rises in insurance premiums, sometimes 10 times what people were paying before, and service charges as well. It's not just the long-term cost that we're talking about, it's the immediate cost being borne by hundreds of thousands of homeowners up and down the country, and a cost that, to be quite frank, many of us can't afford at all.
And we've spoken to Hazel, who you referred to there, here on the BBC. All right, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed. That's Paul Afshar there. Thank you.